Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of At War, the podcast series by the Conflict Law Center at the Research Society of International Law. Today we will be discussing all things nuclear, and we are pleased to be joined by Ms. Sitara Noor. Sitara is a senior research associate at the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies, Islamabad, and her area of expertise is nuclear and regional security issues. Thank you for joining us, Sitara.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
So, Sitara, why don't we start by discussing one of your most recent piece in which you've referred to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis as a global nuclear disorder. We've been used to reading about how nuclear weapons act as a deterrent. They act as a stabilizing force. Some neo-realist scholars also argue that. So, could you please expand a bit on why you state that we have a disorder emerging?
So, if we look at the global nuclear order, it is in a kind of a state of disarray for quite some time now. And I think some of the elements that we have been witnessing even before the Ukrainian war, some of the elements probably has been expedited because of the start of war. And the when I talk about the disorder, I think I'm looking at three important elements. First and foremost, I think it's the centrality of the nuclear weapons that has come into the debate once again. And the nuclear order was premised on the fact that there would be, I mean, as per the NPT, there was five nuclear weapon states, and the rest of the countries entered into a grand bargain and decided not to acquire nuclear weapons. But that premise probably is somewhat shaken by the war itself, because the idea of deterrence, which was very central to the overall nuclear order, is on shaky grounds, perhaps because the global the security umbrella guarantees, or the security guarantees that have been extended to different countries are questioning that as a result of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So how much that security guarantee is strengthened, or should be taken on the face value, or the countries actually should acquire nuclear weapons for themselves. And in that regard, I think most important countries to look at would be Japan and South Korea, where this debate on acquiring nuclear weapons, or how strong the US security extended deterrence works for them, probably were under question even before the war. But I think this debate has become more prominent after the war. And the second thing is the second thing which I look at it in the perspective of the Ukrainian-Russian war is the threat or the risk of a nuclear taboo being sabotaged, or the possibility of nuclear weapons actually being used in a crisis. As we look at war, perhaps the chances are very, very remote as we see how the war is developing. But still, this is something we cannot completely rule out, considering how war is developing. Right. Although it is in the interest of all the actors not to, lead up to that situation, but the very fact that the Russian president threatened, or put the nuclear weapons at an high alert at the very beginning of the war, perhaps this is where I think I see a state of disorder even over there as well. Notwithstanding the fact that the risk of nuclear leading it up to escalating to the nuclear level are very, very minute, and as per some of the US officials, it's less than 1%. But even still, the risk, as soon as you put the nuclear weapons on the high alert, the risk of accidental escalation cannot be ruled out completely. Absolutely. And the third element within whole debate, I think, is the risk to the non-proliferation or the arms control agreements, which some of them are already in place, but the US and Russia had been the main leading actors who were leading the debate on the nuclear non-proliferation and the arms control. And I think some of the treaties which has already seen their demise, for instance, the ANF treaty or the ballistic ABM treaty by the US. So this trend is actually going on, and this is where I see there is a state of disorder in the
Right.
world.
No, it's some very interesting points you mentioned. I was especially interested in what you said about the nuclear umbrella, or the provided by the US, or the lack thereof. And when this crisis started, this was a question a lot of people started bringing up with. And even though there were some factual inaccuracies, but the fact is, a lot of people kept saying, "Oh, if Ukraine had not given up their nuclear weapons, even though they were, I think, Soviet weapons. But this is something a lot of people have been speaking about online and in opinion pieces. And when you and also what you said about Japan and South Korea, I also think what about Taiwan and China? Maybe China looks at it as a test case. Okay, so these are how far they can probably view the Russian experience as a litmus test to see how far they can push the lines before the US or their allies respond. But another thing which I read in your article was how Russia resorted to nuclear brinkmanship, and how because of it, it did gain some of its objectives. But I want to ask you, did Russia really gain its objectives? Because even a few days back there was a statement that, oh, we are putting our nuclear arsenal on a high alert. This was said in the beginning as well, but the war is going on. The West continues to provide, NATO countries continue to provide Ukraine with weapons. So is the nuclear brinkmanship working? Is like the threat, there's this phrase that you use, escalate to de-escalate. Is that really working for Russia or not so much?
So you see, when we talk about escalate to de-escalate, this is where this is Russia's official policy that have been we have seen in various documents and the official statements as well. So I think when Russia talks about escalate to de-escalate, they are probably referring to the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons, because they do have the first use option as well.
Right.
But if you look at, would this situation lead to, or would this lead to actually a position where weapons would be used, or what is the point of Russia's brinkmanship in the first place? So I think the first and primary objective for Russia to signal that was primarily pushing away the US and the NATO's direct involvement.
Right.
As far as that objective is concerned, perhaps they have achieved it to a certain extent.
Sure.
Because despite the risks, or despite so much talk about that there might be a no-fly zone being imposed, but that did not happen.
Right.
Because that would have been a declaration of war from the NATO side. So this did not happen in the Ukraine, and we still see that there is tacit, support to the Ukraine, and there is material and money and ammunition, all sorts of support is being offered to the Ukrainian government. But there is still no direct involvement from the NATO side or from the US side, more active involvement, I would say. So perhaps this is where Russia, to an extent, has achieved the objective of pushing them back, or
Right.
putting the risk of the threat of nuclear weapons up front at the very beginning. But as I say, it's an evolving situation. We are It's an evolving situation, and the risk of escalation through miscalculation, or the different reasons which could become lead to some escalation, can't be completely ruled out. But as far as the situation now is concerned, as I said, it's an evolving situation, and both sides are holding on to the grounds where they had started off. So we'll see.
Right. And speaking of miscalculation, so let us use that to narrow down to Pakistan and our immediate region. A few months back, there was the so-called Brahmos incident. Before we go on to the analysis of that, would you like to share with our audience what that incident was?
So you see, on March 9, 2022, a supersonic object flew into Pakistan, as we see in the news reports. And later on, ISPR gave a press briefing on that. And that turned out to be an Indian missile, which flew over around 124 kilometers inside Pakistani territories at the height of about 4,000 kilometers.
Right.
And so this is first of its kind incident, which raised so many speculations and so many questions. And I think there are so many questions from the Pakistani side, and all those are valid questions, I think. And I also would want to see how India responded. The Indian response came 2 days later, and in the statement that they offered 2 days after the Pakistan's ISPR's presser, they gave this vague sort of statement in which they said, like, there was this accidental launch during routine maintenance, and that was about it. They did not offer any explanation whatsoever. And I think it's a very, very significant and serious incident for a number of reasons. First and foremost, I think it is important to analyze this incident in the broader context.
You even mentioned in your piece that this had the potential to spark a nuclear conflict.
It certainly can.
Yeah.
And why I say that, I mean, it's not to overstate something, but I think the incident nature of incident is such, it is also important not to understate the significance of incident of this kind, that too between two nuclear weapon states whose bilateral relations are at their lowest.
Yeah.
There is an active uh, conflict situation, or contestation on the territory, and there is a geographical contiguity as well.
Yeah.
So there are a number of factors which make this case particularly very unique and particularly very concerning. And as I said, it also needs to be seen in the broader perspective. I think if we look at what is the current situation between the two countries, just a week before Indian Navy's submarine was detected in
Yeah.
Pakistan's exclusive economic zone.
Yep.
This is again something, violation of the norms and the violation of the bilateral understandings and agreements and the territory. And then lately, consistently and steadily, India is doing away with some of the, you may say, India is speeding up the possibility of, if they have to launch, nuclear missiles or the conventional missiles for that matter. For instance, there are India is doing away some of the steps which would slow the process. For instance, India is moving on to the canisterization of the missiles, and there is
Could you please elaborate on that for our audience? What does that mean? The canisterization of the missiles.
so basically, if the canisterization basically means India's missile would be in a ready form.
Okay.
They would be very
So they won't
quickly.
be in an unmated form, which is
No, mating and unmating would be slightly different, but for the launch purposes, I
Yeah.
think this is something which would actually speed up the process
Okay.
way too much as per the other missiles that are
Right.
there.
Right.
So this is doing away with some of the steps which would precisely slow the process. So mating basically comes in different terms, in terms of are the nuclear warheads
Right.
attached to that or not.
Right.
So as of now, what we know of Indian program, they do not have the missiles in the mated form. But again, this is something we are taking on the face value, and the way India is kind of how for the choice of better words, I think the way India is transforming its nuclear outlook is, I think, concerning, and not very hopeful signals are coming from that. And the second thing, apart from the canisterization of the missiles, is that India slowly and steadily has diluted its no first use
Yeah.
pledge, in a sense that there was no absolute NFU in the first place, and
Yeah.
whatever form and shape it was there, perhaps Pakistan did not believe in that because it's just a pledge, right? But even on the official front, whatever form and shape of the nuclear pledge was, NFU pledge was there in the India's nuclear doctrine of 2013, 2003, sorry. Indian official statements are coming to the effect where they are doing away with the NFU pledge as well.
Yeah.
So
No,
which
and
means India might actually go for the first use. And this is also happening when we are witnessing some of the reports which suggest that India is toying with the idea of preemptive counterforce strikes.
right.
So, which essentially means that India might not only just take the counterforce strikes against Pakistan's specific targets. So, these kind of reports and these kind of developments which we witness from the Indian side, coupled with these kind of incidents where a missile just flies off the Indian side and lands in the Pakistan's territory, are extremely concerning, because first of all, the most important next step should have been India informing Pakistan right away, which did not happen. India and Pakistan has this hotline agreement, which is essentially in place there to inform one another of such things happening,
Right.
if such an incident happens. But this wasn't used, and there was no other possible communication, and the statement that came from the Indian side was absolutely vague and not giving away any information. So we do not know as of now, was it a safety issue, or was that a security breach?
Right.
So there are so many questions which Indian leadership has to answer, and I think Pakistan should not stop asking those tough questions.
And you speak about building narrative. It's so surprising, the sounds that have been coming from India recently. Even at the height of the Balakot crisis, our leadership was constantly saying that these weapons are political weapons. You don't use them. You don't talk about them lightly.
Mm-hmm.
These are our final resort. But when you compare that to some of the statements coming from India, I remember someone said something to the effect of "Ye humne holi ke liye nahi rakhe."
Yes.
So they're basically building that whole narrative, and perhaps changing on their way to changing their stated nuclear posture as well. But speaking of narratives, how would you comment on Pakistan's response and restraint? So I want to break this into two parts. We had Ijaz Haider over for a podcast once, and he said that whenever you have a missile coming in, you can either fail safe or fail impotent, because there's no way for you to tell
Mm-hmm.
that whether it has a nuclear warhead or it's a conventional weapon.
Precisely.
So in that context, how would you rate Pakistan's restraint? But also, when speaking about Pakistan's response, do you think we could have done more to highlight this incident? I remember when Balakot happened, like all the Indian press and all Indian media went on and on about how Pakistan had violated the end user agreement by allegedly using our F-16s in an operation against India. But on our side, there a lot of people have felt that the response was very muted. Perhaps we often complain how Pakistan is a classic case of bad se badnaam bura.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we missed an opportunity here to do the same and they've actually done something,
Mm-hmm.
even if they say it's a mistake? My understanding is all such weapon systems have a lot of fail safes. They're multi it's not like you press the button on your car, even when all these push start vehicles that are in the market now. Even for them, you have to press the brake and then press the button once the car starts. So it's very unimaginable that a nuclear capable missile just randomly accidentally launched into your adversary's territory, and they're like, oh, it's just a mistake, and very muted response from them and from us. So what would you say to that?
So you see, first of all, as I said in the beginning, this is something very, very serious, and it speaks of incompetence from on the Indian side. And whether it's a safety breach or it's a security lapse, it's an incompetence, and incompetence leads to escalation. This is as serious as that,
Right.
right? And you are very right that, I mean, Pakistan's response, I mean, of course, one cannot suggest that the response should have been something kinetic in nature or something shooting down the missile, or because you see, the flight time is hardly 7 minutes between
Yeah.
the two countries, right? So there is no possibility of these are the risks that we talk about all the time,
Yeah.
that because of the geographical contiguity, you do not have much time to you know uh, decide the incoming missile, which sort of in missile is that? Is it nuclear or conventional, or just a random missile
Yeah.
mistakenly flying inside our territory, right?
Absolutely.
So the broader, since the broader atmosphere was not very escalatory at that time. I mean, we were not in active hostility at that time. So perhaps Pakistan did act rationally by not, putting their missile on the high alert in response, or the way we suggest we would do in case of an event of war or things like that. But having said that, I think still Pakistan's response could have been more forceful. I think we did not. Just imagine, just flip it on the other side. Had it been some Pakistani missile flown into the Indian side, all hell would have broken loose, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
not just in Indian side, but across the world,
Yeah.
right? But response was not. There were questions, but there were no serious questions asked from the Indian side.
Yeah.
India got away. We may say that India got away, but just issuing a statement that it was a missile erroneously fired during a routine maintenance, and
Yeah.
that's about it.
Absolutely. And
And this also comes, I think, India got off the hook primarily because of, when we take a step back and look at the broader security situation, how India is towing the line of the United States in terms of offering becoming the strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific,
Right.
the broader Indo-Pacific security scenario. But I think, regardless of that, this is something which is very serious for the regional security, and any country should show some responsibility. And as I said in the beginning, that Pakistan should not stop asking those hard questions, regardless of how much noise we can make and how much effective they are. But I think we continuously should, because this is a matter of security of not just for Pakistan, but I think of the entire region. Because, as I said, incompetence would lead to escalation. If
Absolutely.
not this time, probably in future.
Yeah.
So if this incompetence continues on the Indian side, this is a recipe for disaster, definitely.
Absolutely. And I remember back in 2010 or 2011, there was an article about how um, it was in the Atlantic, the ally from hell,
Hmm.
maybe that was the title. And from that point onward, you've been seeing this consistent narrative. Oh, Pakistan's nuclear weapons are a risk. Pakistan's nuclear weapons might fall into the wrong hands. And in the most recent report on nuclear safety protocols, I think Pakistan was the most improved state. In
Hmm.
some areas, we've even outranked India. But
Yes.
against this whole the vacuum of narrative with regards to presenting ourselves as a responsible state and presenting India as an irresponsible state. And on that note, you wrote a piece a while back titled India's Radioactive Bazaar. Um, in Even when I think about that, we saw one or two statements here and there, but our global narrative building exercise, people are walking around with uranium as if you'd walk around with a bag of onions or tomatoes. And if had that happened in Pakistan, all hell would have broken loose. So do you think we also missed a beat on that front? And also, if you could, some people also added that Pakistanis are just fear mongering. It's just like raw uranium, or you need to process it a lot till it gets to a point where it can be used in a nuclear weapon.
Hmm.
So do you think we are actually fear mongering and there was nothing to worry about?
So you see, I would address this question not from the political front, but more from the technical side.
Right.
And this is where I think we can differentiate between the fear mongering and what actually is needed to be done in that regard. Because it's the way Pakistan is being blamed, everything is wrong. I think we should take a more serious uh, look at how and what needs to be done in India and what's wrong in India system in the first place.
Yeah.
And so I'll purely look at it from the the technical perspective. Why? Because first of all, this is, again, as I said in the previous question, this is something definitely serious. And if somebody says, just brushes it aside by just saying that it's fear mongering, I think that's not the case. Because consequences or the repercussions of such incidents leading to something bigger are serious. And I mean, there can be some serious consequences as a result of that. Why do I say that? First of all, I think it's not just one of an incident where some of the Indians, news reporters, or for that matter, the official statements to the effect that, it's just raw uranium and nothing to worry about. There definitely is need to be worried about. Why? Because there is a consistent pattern.
Yeah.
It's not one of an event. There have been reports of uranium being sold in the Indian markets in over the past few years consistently, right? And what does that tell us about India's regulatory system or nuclear management overall? First and foremost, I think it suggests or it indicates that there is a gap in India's material accounting and control system. And a material accounting and control system is something, the basic technical requirement every country must have, whosoever develops a nuclear program or has the radioactive material for health, in the health industry, or the other industries as well. Because nuclear material or the radiological materials are not just used for the weapon purposes, but
Absolutely.
they have like various civilian applications as well.
Right.
And the one used in the civilian applications also needs to be protected. Because if they fall into the wrong hands, into the with the people with a malicious intent, they can do a number of things. For instance, creating a dirty bomb out of it, creating just spreading the radioactivity across,
Yeah.
by detonating it with a conventional bomb or
Right.
material. So there are serious consequences if it just loosely is found here and there. So this definitely is not fear mongering. This definitely needs serious attention. And as I said, the first thing it tells us about India's system is that there is lack in the material accounting and control, because any country, be it India or Pakistan, from uranium mines to the the reactors or the enrichment facilities, wherever the material goes, there has to be a very strong material accounting and control system so that not an iota of material goes out of regulatory control. So this is the first requirement every country has to fulfill.
Right.
Perhaps there is if material is going missing, perhaps that part is not really strongly taken care of.
Yeah.
And secondly, there is definitely involvement of some insider, right? There is somebody within the India's nuclear community who is kind of involved in this kind of activity, because these are not just random materials
Absolutely.
available off the shelf or just randomly
Right.
available here in the markets. So definitely there is some involvement in from the insider. So that suggests there is a weakness in India's personnel reliability program.
Right.
The people they have employed are not really checked thoroughly, and they are involved with the people where, even if they are selling it for the monetary benefit, it might end up in the
It's a
wrong hands.
controlled substance, so
It's
if
a controlled
and
substance.
all of this is happening at a time when there's an ever increasing push for India to be included in the nuclear suppliers group.
Yes.
And when you think of, so I want you to put aside your Pakistani strategic thinker hat and just think as a neutral strategic thinker. um we see with the Brahmos incident, India basically got off without a very with a very hollow statement. All these incidents of uranium being sold openly in Indian markets. But at the same time, India and the US, they are getting closer and closer because of their larger strategic future in the Indo-Pacific region. Would you say that the US is perhaps making a mistake in the long run, turning a blind eye, if you want to call it that, towards India's mistakes?
So you see, in these are, I think, in the grand scheme of things, perhaps for the US, these are some small irritants or very insignificant events, considering uh, the strategic objectives and why India is needed as part of, you know, uh, the India the as a net security provider in the US's Indo-Pacific strategy in containing China, or placing India as a net security provider, or a counterweight to China, things like that.
Right.
All the talks that we hear about what are the roles and responsibilities. Uh, but these are the things which I think are not only needed, would be required for the US should be pushing. I think this is for India's own sake. These are the things India must, improve and do some work on, and some introspection and some assessment within. Because for anybody else, the kind of incidents that we have talked about, they threaten India's own security as well.
Right.
And as a responsible nuclear weapon state, or as a responsible actor at the global stage, I think these incidents, and the repeated, for that matter, repeated incidents, do not really look good.
And
And
because all of these things are happening in a very short span of time, like,
yes.
these are not, so like one incident happened in 2006, another happened now. All of these things, the Brahmos, the repeated nuclear bazaar incidents, all of these are happening like very, very frequently. So it is worrying. And as you said, someone who might be handling it might not be aware from a technical perspective how
Mhm.
harmful uranium is, or all these other radioactive elements are for the larger population. So that's also a very valid internal security constraint, especially at a time when we are starting to see more and more internal fissures
Yes.
within Indian domestic politics as well.
And you see, because as I said, this is for, apart from specifically for with regard to the nuclear material, because we, as you rightly stated, that there are internal fissures, there are homegrown terrorist organizations as well. There are people who would want to, take some advantage out of a situation where they can, create some scenario and put the blame on Pakistan.
Yeah.
That Pakistan is the perpetrator, but the reasons would be very much homegrown.
Yeah.
So it has ramifications not just for India, but for the regional security as well. And it is also important for India's image as a responsible nuclear weapon states, because, if we as I said in the beginning, apart from political points or political shots or the criticism that we might initiate from the Pakistani side, I think this is the global, as a responsible state, these are the responsibilities on India, because if we look at India being part of signatory to the Convention for Physical Protection on Nuclear Material and Facilities, and its 2005 amendment, which India has signed and ratified, as a as part of that entity, India is supposed to have an independent regulatory authority, which would ensure that, these regulations are in place, such incidents do not happen, and they would basically regulate the entire process. But in India's case, for instance, India's regulatory board is part of atomic energy. India's regulatory board is part of the Atomic Energy Department of Atomic Energy.
Okay.
Right. So if something goes wrong in the Atomic Energy Department of Atomic Energy, the board, being the subset of it, cannot point out, like, this is something wrong, you need to correct it. But India is required to have an independent authority in its function and position, which right now is not available. And then if we look at, India is embarking on a very ambitious nuclear energy program. There are about 22 reactors operating, and there are almost 21 reactors under construction. So it's a massive development that is taking place.
And are these reactors mostly dual use, or?
They are for the energy purposes. They are for the energy purposes. I mean, I'm not even talking about the weapons program, which is as massive as it can get. Right. So, because these regulations are only for the civilian purposes.
Sure.
Unfortunately, India's, and for that matter, any country's nuclear weapon program is not globally regulated, or the country is not answerable to International Atomic Energy Agency for the regulations, but it is expected of that country that, as a responsible state and for the security of their own citizens, they would employ these regulations, and they would employ the system, they would put the systems in place which would save their own environment and the people and the state overall. Right. So, as I keep saying, that this is important for the regional security, of course, but this is more important for India's people's own safety, because nuclear material or radioactive material just randomly being sold here and there is something really concerning.
Right, absolutely. And so you spoke about regional stability. So again, we've moving on again from Pakistan to the wider region, and we've discussed how the US sees India as a probable counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific region. For the past decade or so, we've read about how the US is shifting some of its attention eastwards. I think it was Hillary Clinton who had that statement, we are now pivoting to Asia. And we've seen some manifestation of it, the US-China competition. In that regard, there was a recent test by the Chinese, which is called the FOBS test. You stated in a piece that a lot of people made a big hue and cry out of it, but you somewhat underplayed it, stating this was not a Sputnik moment everyone was making it out to be. So before we get into the details of that, could you please elaborate on what FOBS is for the sake of our audience, and why did you draw a parallel with the Sputnik moment?
So first of all, you see, since the US pivot to Asia, or the US's focus on the Indo-Pacific region, the US and Washington's focus on the Beijing has increased exponentially. And we have been seeing, like in various US documents, China has, which originally was perhaps a competitor, has now become, more of a confrontational tone from the United States side. Right. And this is happening notwithstanding the fact that if we look at the China's military development and the number of systems that they have, or the weapons that they have, is far less as compared to the US and Russia, but still the US focus has been, definitely very much on the Chinese development. And so the US meltdown over China's purported, fractional orbital bombardment system, or the FOBS that we call it, comes in within that broader perspective, where anything China does is something taken, stretches beyond the proportion, or gains greater attention than probably it deserves. And when the Financial Times story was broke that China did conduct a FOBS test, we see subsequent statements, as you rightly said there was massive hue and cry that this is something extraordinary. It was the US General Mark Milley who described this as a Sputnik, something close to the Sputnik moment.
Right.
And why did I say that it wasn't a Sputnik moment? Primarily because first and foremost, FOBS is not something altogether new.
Can you also elaborate on what FOBS really is,
Mhm.
for the sake of our audience? What is FOBS,
So basically,
and how is it? Sorry, and how is it different from what we see in
Mhm.
use right now?
So basically, FOBS in the test, China basically combined the two technologies, right?
Right.
When I say the fractional orbital bombardment system, China used a hypersonic glide vehicle. They combined the two, and as a result of that, they uh, theoretically they flew a nuclear capable missile around the globe.
Okay.
Uh, you know,
Yeah.
and
That sounds good.
this is something. But as I said, this is not something which has been done for the FOBS is not something which has been done for the very first time.
Right.
The Soviet Union used this technology or developed this technology in 1970s,
Okay.
and did that primarily against the American Safeguards anti-ballistic missile system.
Right.
Right, but once the missile that ABM system was no more there, so the Soviets also shelved that program.
Right.
And similarly, the American Air Force had the similar system in the form of X-37B orbital test vehicle.
Right.
So this is something, as I said, is not something because the Sputnik moment was something where the Sputnik moment was when Soviet Union took a major leap in their space development when they sent a satellite into the space when the US and Soviet Union were in a space race. US hadn't achieved that level, but Soviets did.
Right.
So so this is not equivalent to Sputnik because the US has already done that, or the technology already exists
Right.
in different forms and shapes. And but to the Chinese credit, perhaps, or the unsettling part for the United States, perhaps justifiably can be because Chinese managed to combine the two.
Okay.
They combined the fractional orbital vehicle through with the hypersonic
Okay.
missile.
Right.
Right. So this probably might be some sort of unsettling part for the United States, but this is again not something which would render American defenses obsolete.
Right.
Why? Because Americans have these fixed anti-ballistic missile systems placed in Alaska and California, which are essentially there to intercept any missiles coming from the North Korea.
Okay.
Right? But that's not about it. These are just one set of systems that the Americans have. Then they have space-based assets which detect the missiles, incoming missiles, through the heat signature. So from any side they are coming, they would be detected
Right.
by the US satellite systems. And then there are sea-based system as well, which can actually detect. They have the global coverage and they can cover missiles coming from any side of the world. So the US has that part covered, and it's not that they suddenly have become vulnerable to the Chinese threat. And they also have some fixed systems within the in the very close range of China, in the South Korea, for instance. They have the THAAD missiles placed
Right.
over there. So this is not something which US which renders American defenses obsolete or gives them a real push. But again, if China is trying to do anything which kind of there is an technological improvement in what China has right now, definitely this is something concerning for the US, because if you look at in the broader strategic competition, the US China competition is growing in the Indo Pacific and at the global front. And there are many manifestation of that crisis, the impending crisis, or this greater competition or confrontation in the form of the US statement on Taiwan, for instance, US impatience, growing impatience on Chinese expansion in the South China Sea, or the various other objectives that US is pursuing in the region through AUKUS, through Quad, and so on and so forth.
And I think another thing could be that the US doesn't really like someone else flexing their muscles. I think I love this theory by Mearsheimer, who says the US doesn't really want another power that has what he calls the freedom to roam around.
Mm-hmm.
There was this piece in there's an incident mentioned in a book how in 2005, because the US always conducts these freedom of navigation operations in the waters of other countries, and up many countries say don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, but they can't really say anything to the US. But I think in the mid 2000s there was an incident when a whole US carrier group was moving along in the East China Sea maybe, or the South China Sea, and a Chinese submarine just popped up in
Mm-hmm.
between. And it wasn't so much that it caused a confrontation, but to the US it signaled that the Chinese were now saying, oh, this is our territory,
Mm-hmm.
so we can respond to you. Because even if you, as you rightly said, that if you do um, a a complete comparison between the two, the US still outpowers
Absolutely.
China. I think
Mm-hmm.
China just inducted their third naval carrier
Mm-hmm.
last month, maybe, or this month.
Yeah.
But the US has been using them for the best part of a century now.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I think it could be because the US doesn't really want someone else to be able to flex their muscles. And anytime someone says like, "Oh, let's put an end to that."
You see, and if we see how the US-China relationship are evolving, uh, as I said, they started off as a competitors, but I think the nature of relationship has pretty much become confrontational, and that is why the patience is growing out. Patience is running out, basically,
Yeah.
on the US side as well as on the Chinese side. I mean, we always say that Chinese have been, you know, employing this is or have been the strategic patience on the Chinese side has been, slowly and steadily they have been, reaching out to the countries and developing economic relationships. But now the US, while the better part of the 21st century, they have been busy in the wars in the Middle East. And meanwhile, China was developing economic relationships through the One Belt and Road Initiative across the region.
Yep.
And so the now US, although they are trying to match up with the economic incentives, but I think China has moved and made its presence in most areas, or they have covered most areas already. So this is something unsettling for the United States.
Yep.
And although Chinese have been talking about that they do not have, they believe in the coexistence and things like that. But I think in the Indo-Pacific region specifically, in the South China Sea specifically, the things are, warming up as we look at it. And over the Taiwan issue, for instance, the recent statements that have come from the US side, and the debate around, as you mentioned in the beginning, that perhaps China is, kind of weighing its options, that how the Russia's invasion in Ukraine pans out. So there are so many, point of views on the table. But one thing that stand out definitely, or one thing that is definitely true for time now, is that the US Chinese confrontation is very much there.
Right, and you spoke about China establishing economic relationship at the same time the US was engaged in all these military operations in the Middle East, and now the US and maybe perhaps the Western Bloc, they've realized they need to counter that. I think just yesterday, the G7 announced an initiative to counter the One Belt One Road,
Mm-hmm.
a massive investment. I think close to $600 billion, if I'm not wrong. But also another thing which China brings to the table, I think, is Stephen Walt wrote about this last year, that they also lend to countries,
Mm-hmm.
but their lending is not based in some of the global norms that the so-called global norms that the US is. So like when IMF gives you money or the World Bank gives you money, they always underpin it with structural reforms, political
Mm-hmm.
reforms. But China is just lending money.
Mm-hmm.
And Walt's argument was to countries with authoritarian regimes or with dictators or where democracy really hasn't flourished, they might prefer China to the
Mm-hmm.
US, because for in the post Second World War era, a lot of the countries, they when they wanted aid from the US, they would resort to what the US was saying in the form of domestic reforms. But now China is coming, they're like, work with us. We don't really want you to do any kind of
We
reforms.
don't, we're not necessarily, yeah.
Yeah, your politics is your matter.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the money. Let's develop.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a very attractive proposition. I'm not saying it's the right way to go about things, but that's very attractive to a lot of countries which are not necessarily living up to the ideals of Western liberal democracy. So what would you say to that?
So you see, with regards to the Chinese investment, I think the United States' biggest concern, or for that matter, their biggest criticism, has always been this issue of transparency on the Chinese side, from the
Right.
Chinese side, right? They have been arguing that, right, China is investing, but it's not a transparent process at all. The countries who are lending monies, who are developing infrastructure and stuff, even there is this criticism from the American side or from the Western world largely that these are the debt traps, and these are the things in the long run would harm the countries, the receiving countries,
Yeah.
right? Uh, but as far as Pakistan is concerned, I think there are multiple reasons why Pakistan relies on the Chinese uh, partnership. Primarily, first and foremost, because the relationship has developed into a strategic partnership.
Right.
Definitely, right? And China has emerged as a reliable partner. And while Pakistan would want to very much develop its relationship with the United States as well, it would not want to do that at the cost of its strategic partnership with the Chinese, because not just on the because of the CBAC, but I think the defense and technical assistance that Pakistan has received from China, uh, specifically at the time when the rest of the world, the support from the rest of the world was completely missing,
Yep.
right? So for Pakistan, I think the Chinese support has been very critical, and Pakistan would want to continue to have that support. But I think as things are warming up in the Indo-Pacific, that space for Pakistan to uh, maintain its relationship with the US as well as with the China, that space, maneuvering space, I think is shrinking very
Right.
fast, and
Yeah.
Pakistan has to walk on to that tightrope where they have to ensure the United States that we are not really, as they call it, falling into the Chinese trap, and keeping up, ensuring Chinese as well that the CPAC related projects do complete on time, because there are various reasons where there is perception that the projects have slowed down, right? So there are various moving pieces in that regard, but I think for Pakistan, maintaining that neutral position between the US, the growing US China's confrontational relationship, I think countries like Pakistan are more affected in terms of but I think as so far Pakistan has tried to uh, stay in the middle, stay neutral, and have given shown this interest, shown this intent that we want to maintain the relationship or balance the relationship with both. And I think Pakistan, it would require political acumen and the strong diplomatic skills, which there is no shortage of in Pakistan, I believe, I trust. But I think uh, this has to be done in a very, very smart manner, and this has to be done in a very, very timely basis.
Right.
We do not have the option to lose opportunities and then kind of try to rebuild that. We have to be very cautious of not losing the opportunities when they come.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to look at things through a Pakistani lens.
Yeah.
So, like, not from an American interest lens or a Chinese interest
Yes,
lens. Even
precisely.
when you're looking at CPEC, yes, CPEC is important for China, but it's also important for the infrastructure and other development in Pakistan as well. So, I think it's important to not lose sight of that. One last question: you said that our maneuvering space is shrinking, and in light of what's been happening recently, ever since, and we're going back to where we started from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. There was a lot of outcry on social media for the past couple of days on Pakistan, the lack of Pakistan's presence in the BRICS
Mhm.
summit. What would you make of that? And do you think that is a sign of China's so-called displeasure with regards to Pakistan?
So I think this is uh, very interesting. And as I said in the beginning, we must dig the facts first. And I think uh, the Foreign Office statement just today, which came out just today, is quite telling that before every BRICS summit, China and Pakistan do coordinate with one another in terms of how Pakistan can become part of it, or can benefit, because Pakistan had been, as a non-party, Pakistan has been participating in the previous summits. But as per the Foreign Office information just today, it was Pakistan's participation was blocked by one country.
Yeah.
So that one country probably is India, considering how this bilateral relationship between the two are going on a negative trajectory, which is unfortunate. Unfortunate to the because at one side, Pakistan is attempting to, reach out to all quarters and reach out to and trying to advocating a more peaceful resolution of the issues and reaching out to or stating that Pakistan wants good relationship with its all neighbors.
Yeah.
Because if we look at the previous governments, or Pakistan's recent national security policy, when we talk about shift to the geoeconomics,
Yep.
the primary requirement of shifting to the geoeconomics is having good relations with all
All your
neighbors.
neighbors, yes.
And we are stuck behind in between antagonist India at one hand and destabilizing Afghanistan on the other. And at one side there is China, and we are not fully able to utilize the potential of our seas as well. So it's a very, very problematic situation. And as far as Pakistan is concerned, I think Pakistan must continue uh, you know working towards the objectives that we have set for ourselves, which essentially means that we want a good relationship with all neighbors. But I think the blocking Pakistan's participation, it's very petty. It's something. It's petty, to
And
say the
especially
least.
especially coming at a time when we've been seeing very positive developments with these arrests of individuals that India has been
Yes.
asking for. So
Yes.
and if you this has been a consistent pattern for the past 3-4 years, that we've our ex prime minister even went so far as to say that, okay, if you take one step forward, we'll take two steps forward.
Yeah.
And we have been extending olive branches after olive branches, but there it's lack of response is one thing,
Mhm.
but the antagonistic response is a completely different thing. And I wonder till what point can Pakistan maintain this, that it's like when you have an issue going on with someone, there comes a point when you say, okay, I can't really keep doing this anymore.
Yeah.
So Pakistan will eventually get to that point. And I think even India, because strategic relationships with the United States is one thing, but India, China, Pakistan, they're all neighbors. And as you mentioned in response to one of the previous questions, was flight times over here are only 7 minutes. So for a cousin living in a foreign country, we can't really have mess up our relationship with people
Yeah.
living right
You
next
can't
door.
even say goodbyes. Within the 7 minutes, you won't even be able to say goodbyes, and the both countries would just
Yeah.
move away from the just you know gone off the face of the earth.
Absolutely, because and you look at the population density in this region,
Yeah.
the number of people living in this region. I think 25% of the world's population is in the Indian subcontinent, and the surrounding areas, China, the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Western Asia. So it's very scary, but I hope we do get to some kind of political maturity that we are able to resolve this. On that note, we'll end this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, Rizvi.
Thank you to all our audience for tuning in, and we hope you'll tune in for future episodes as well. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.